Hello, my name is Shannon Hayden and I will be your tour guide, and today we will be looking at neoclassical architecture in the United States. Neoclassical architecture emerged in the late 18th century as a product of the neoclassical movement in art. Neoclassical style is derived from architecture of classical antiquity. Think ancient Greece and Rome. Classical themes and elements are used to promote a sense of power and authority. The first building we will look at is located right here in Baltimore City, Maryland. It is the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Baltimore Basilica for short. The basilica's subject matter is religion. It was the first Roman Catholic cathedral built in the United States. It was constructed between 1806 and 1821 and designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, an architect whose work will come up a few more times throughout this tour. Latrobe designed the cathedral with the help of Bishop John Carroll. It was meant to symbolize the newly acquired religious freedom in the United States after the signing of the Constitution. This is why parts of the basilica resemble the United States Capitol. The building follows a classic Latin cross basilica plan, following a long-standing tradition of cathedral architecture in Europe, with a longitudinal axis and a dome. The interior is very open with a lot of natural light from the central dome. Almost immediately, the viewer's eye is drawn up to the dome, a move made by architects to draw the viewer towards heaven. Next, we will look at the exterior of the building, which draws from a classic Greek temple with large columns made of stone and two towers raised from behind. When first built, the basilica rested on a hill overlooking the Baltimore harbor. Today, high-rise buildings have blocked this view. Instead, it sits in the Mount Vernon neighborhood and is still used as a church. Recently, the basilica went through a $34 million restoration project to reinstitute the interior to match Latrobe's original design that had been altered throughout the years. Visitors are welcome to come admire the architecture of America's first cathedral. Moving on, we travel from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. to look at one of the most recognizable buildings in the world, the United States Capitol. The Capitol is used for government purposes and designed with those purposes in mind. Thomas Jefferson wanted a Congress building that would be modeled after a Roman temple, a nod to another great republic. The design of the building, like the basilica we just saw, evokes the ideals of the Greeks and Romans. There are many architects who have contributed to the construction and following expansion of the Capitol building. Starting in 1793, Dr. William Thornton began construction. After a series of failed architects, Benjamin Henry Latrobe, told you we'd see him again, stepped in and continued construction of the north and south wings, finishing in 1813. Not too long after, British troops set fire to the Capitol, and Latrobe came back to make repairs to the building and introduced marble into its construction because it lasted longer than the original sandstone used. From there, the Capitol building continued to see a slew of different architects come in and add on to house the growing government of the United States. I want to specifically direct your attention to the Capitol dome. What you see now is not the original dome. That had to be removed because it became too small for the massive building. Thomas Walter designed the dome that stands today. It is made out of over 8 million pounds of cast iron. Iron was chosen for practical reasons. It is fireproof and needs less restoration than wood or another material. It has become one of the biggest man-made landmarks in the United States, standing alone at 288 feet. Now, if we can take a step back just to really look at the building as a whole, its subject matter is housing the legislative government branch. I do not expect this to change in my lifetime or yours. It also symbolizes freedom and a new America that the Founding Fathers built. Just look at the balance of the building. It is symmetrical and repetitive, but in a grandeur way that just works well. It dominates the area in which it sits, making it an earth-resting building. There's not too much right around it because it just pushes everything else out. That's how big it is. Also, I want you to again notice the Ionic columns holding the exterior of the building up. These are taken from Greek roots. They are meant to symbolize the new republic. We don't have enough time to truly go over all of the details of the United States Capitol building, but I hope from what I have shown you, you can discern the neoclassical style of the structure and the reasoning that the many different architects chose this style. From one government building to the next, we move on to a newer structure that still keeps the neoclassical style of the other government buildings in Washington, D.C. The United States Supreme Court, designed by architect Cass Gilbert, started construction in 1932 and opened in 1935. It is located adjacent to the U.S. Capitol and the Library of Congress. Gilbert drew upon classical Roman temple form when designing the building. Visitors must walk up a broad flight of stairs and enter through the 16 Corinthian columns. The building itself is a steel-frame structure faced with white marble. Gilbert wanted to create a style that mixed classical grandeur, like we saw with the U.S. Capitol building, and quiet dignity as a way to represent the nation's highest court. Gilbert's design called for many sculptural pieces. as well, both on the exterior of the building and its interior. Symbols of justice are sculpted into the flagpoles located on both the east and west pediment, which is just right above the columns, are different works of art carved into the stone bearing the names Justice, the Guardian of Liberty, and Equal Justice under the Law. Busts of chief justices can be found inside the Great Hall. Carvings of more allegorical figures can be found in the law library housed inside the building. Also inside, more marble columns can be found, providing a strong foundation for the building, as well as building on the neoclassical style. Gilbert's designs for the interior deliberately separate the justices' working areas from the public, ensuring them privacy to work. Again, with this building, we see a repetition of line from the columns and the sharp lines of the structure. Balance is achieved by making the building symmetrical. The marble provides an element of grandiosity, but the smaller scale of the building compared to the Capitol keeps the sense of dignity that Gilbert wanted when creating the Supreme Court. The location cements why the neoclassic style was chosen. It sits right between the two neoclassic famous buildings. The Supreme Court is a co-equal branch of government, so it had to be equal in style as well. Now we will move further down south to Virginia as we finish out our tour of neoclassical architecture in the United States. We will be looking at two great works by the third president and self-taught architect, Thomas Jefferson. To start, let's look at Jefferson's primary residence, Monticello. The name Monticello can be translated from Italian to mean little mountain, a very fitting description, seeing how Monticello sits on the summit of an 850-foot peak in the southwest mountain region, right by Charlottesville, Virginia. Jefferson used slaves and workers to level out the top of the mountain in order to build his magnificent 43-room plantation. Thomas Jefferson began work on Monticello in 1769, but it did not become the neoclassical structure that you see today until 1796, when Jefferson came back from Europe after serving as the Minister of the United States in France. During his 5 years in Europe, Jefferson became accustomed to the new classical styles of the buildings and brought back what he learned and used it to remodel and expand Monticello. Jefferson was most influenced by the Italian architect Andrea Palladio. He mixed his own love of classical architecture with his own style and materials available to him in Virginia to create the Jeffersonian architecture that you see today. For example, the bricks that make up Monticello were made at the plantation itself. Most of the wood used came from Jefferson's land, as well as the stone for the cellar and the columns. While some materials had to be shipped in, like the glass for the windows, it is clear Jefferson wanted to use materials that he could cultivate from his own property. When remodeling Monticello, Jefferson added in the famous octagonal dome in place of a second-story portico, which is an Italian porch, something that had originally been in the design for Monticello. Not only does the dome lead the viewer to understand Monticello as a neoclassical structure, but also the columns that we have seen throughout the tour are present here as well. Underneath the columns are the portico steps that one walks up when visiting Monticello. Jefferson also added Venetian porches to both sides of his plantation. Today, Monticello is no longer a private residence, but instead it is owned by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and acts as a museum and educational institution. It is also a National Historic Landmark and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. One can go and view the neoclassical style that Jefferson was. Not far from Monticello is another one of Thomas Jefferson's prized architectural works, the University of Virginia, located in Charlottesville, Virginia. Jefferson envisioned an academical village when building the school. One building in particular that we will look at is the Rotunda, which is located at the head of UVA's prestigious lawn. The Rotunda began construction in 1822 and finished in 1826 after Jefferson died. It was designed to look like the Pantheon in Rome. It is about half of its Roman counterpart size, though. Again, we see the dome and columns present in this neoclassical structure. Inside the Rotunda, it is a very open space as to encourage inclusivity and learning as a community. The Rotunda originally housed a library. This was a big deal at the time of construction because these buildings that were central to a university typically held churches. The library in the Rotunda was a choice by Jefferson, who believed wholly in the separation of church and state. With both Monticello and the University of Virginia's Rotunda, we can see Jefferson's personal ideals mixed with classical architecture. Like the other buildings we have looked at, these two are balanced beautifully, so much that it is almost calming to the eye. Both are earth-resting buildings that simply sit on the ground with no strong relationship to it. Monticello stands by itself, and other neoclassical buildings that Jefferson created for his university surround the Rotunda. Obviously, he and other architects that we have looked at today were greatly influenced by the Greeks and Romans. Every building that we have touched on had some relation to the United States government, which shows just how influenced the Founding Fathers were by the republics of the past. Thank you for taking the time to join me on this tour. I hope you enjoyed exploring the many examples of neoclassical architecture in the United States.